My name is Joetta DeBella. I'll be doing the interview with Stephanie Edwards. It is July 20th, 2010. It is for the Archive of American Television, and we are shooting at the Television Academy in North Hollywood, California.
Ann Edwards.
When were you born?
November 8th, 1943, you dog.
And where were you born?
Faribault, Minnesota.
Where is that located?
It is the tiny town, 14 miles from an even tinier town where I was raised, Kenyon, Minnesota. It was a very rural farm community, and it still is. And I was just there for 12 days. Hasn't changed much at all.
Wow. What is your father's name?
Walter Bud Edwards. Contrary to popular myth, I mean, for those who happen to be familiar with me, it's been commonly believed that I was Ralph Edwards' daughter and that was how I got my start. When Ralph Edwards met me, he said, "Hi, sis." Interesting, different take on that whole relationship. And coincidentally, the closest I ever got to Ralph Edwards was via my mother-in-law, Joanne Jordan, who was the lady on This Is Your Life who crossed her palm with Hazel Bishop lipstick and would rub it and it wouldn't come out. She was a very beautiful commercial actress. So she knew Ralph Edwards, but I had never met him before, sometime vastly later.
How did that rumor start?
I don't know, but you know, it's impossible to get rid of rumors. In fact, my husband, whose name is Murray McLeod, it's not Steve Edwards, Jeff Edwards, Vince Edwards, or all of the other Edwardses. None of us are related to each other. Poor Murray's been walking around for 35 years as my husband. Murray tried to reach a website where I was listed as the daughter of Ralph Edwards and talked to some human on the phone who said, no, once it's on our website, it does not change. And so somewhere, I am still listed as Ralph Edwards' daughter, which bothers my dad in Portland, Oregon, a lot.
So your dad was Bud, and what did he do as a career?
My dad was a florist. Mom and Dad divorced when I was 3. In those days, that was, really rather unusual. They'd had one of those World War II wartime letter-writing romances. And Dad wrote wonderful letters and courted Mother that way, but they really didn't know each other very well when they married. So by the time she had moved to Oregon to live with his family and found herself terribly lonely and a fish out of water, and Dad was kind of married to their farm with cherry orchards and a lot of flowers. He was a florist even then. They realized this was a relationship that just was not meant to be, and so Mother and I got on a train, and I remember this, and took a train back to Minnesota. And I reunited with my dad after I was about 32 years old. We hit it off immediately. My husband said, "That's where this face comes from," because I didn't resemble the family he had met in Minnesota. I resembled my dad. And so Bud Edwards and I have had a wonderful rapport ever since. It's been lovely.
What is your mother's name?
Geraldine Larson. When I was born, my grandpa, who named Mother Geraldine, said, "You're naming her Stephanie? Isn't that an awfully long handle to put on a little girl, Geraldine?" It's a family joke.
What did she do?
Mother should have been the performer. Mom went 1 year to St. Olaf College. I did too, but I didn't want to stay. She did. St. Olaf College is this wonderful place in the middle of Minnesota that Betty White on The Golden Girls kind of made famous. And it's very similar to what Betty portrayed so wonderfully. St. Olaf College is known still for having one of the finest a cappella choirs in the world. And Mother was one of the few freshmen who sang as a soprano with that choir. She had a wonderful voice. She was much more desirous of the lights than I was. it was Mom who should have had a career. But she had a little girl by the time she was 20. Mom is 20 years older than I am. So for a time, she worked in Minneapolis, which still is a really progressive, hot town, as a medical assistant, and she sang radio jingles in her spare time. And then married a farmer from Little Canyon, Minnesota, and did not go into show business. She became a farmer's wife, but remained very much, much more inclined toward that excitement that goes with show business actually than I was. And later on, in middle age, Mom got her pilot's license to keep up with my stepdad, who was a farmer but who loved to fly a private plane. And she studied the computer and became a travel agent for a while and taught voice lessons in middle age. So Mom continued to kind of be out there doing stuff.
So what traits did you inherit from each of them?
From my dad, being an Edwards means you can make great conversation, but you're not necessarily as warm as you would like to be. There's a little bit of a coolness to the Edwards personality, diametrically opposite to Mom's side of the family. And from Mother, in whose family, the Larsons, where I was really raised, and for a time by my beloved maternal grandparents, there was a lot of effusive friendliness, caring, and the sparkle. The sparkle comes from Mother's side. My dad and I talk about the fact that if you're in Edwards, you never get too excited or too low. That doesn't work for show business. And though I had a great deal of desire, I was not a competitor, never have been. And that did not do my career much good. You've got to be able to compete, you know. I had the desire without the aggression. I wasn't driven. And then I married happily, which took the edge off even more what little competitive drive I had. Settling into domestic bliss is not so good for a career. It's great for your life and your heart. And Murray and I now have been married wonderfully for 35 years, but it didn't do our careers a bit of good.
What were your interests as a child?
I was, as you hear so often from people in show business, it's more than a cliche. I was very shy, and I was tall, skinny. I knew I loved music. I played the trombone in the high school band and got very good at it, but was so embarrassed because a tall, skinny girl playing a trombone is not attractive. I wanted to play the French horn, but my grandfather, a mortician and furniture salesman, who tap danced at all the parties. Grandpa said, well, now it's fine, honey girl, that you want to play the French horn, but there is a trombone already in the family. You know, I played it and your Uncle Eddie played it. Why don't you start out with the trombone? And then if you prove to be good, you can always switch. Well, anyone who knows instruments knows that you do not switch from the embouchure of a trombone mouthpiece to the embouchure of a French horn mouthpiece. I was stuck with the trombone, and I was always terribly embarrassed by it. But I loved music, took a lot of piano, sang in the school choirs and so on. So music was that. And then, as a kid, into whose home television was introduced when I was 9. We lived on a farm. Indoor plumbing was still rather a new thing. The television set came when I was 9. The first show I saw was Howdy Doody of an afternoon somewhere. And I realized that whatever that was what I wanted. Eventually I was able to put the word to it. I wanted to be an actor, but I couldn't compete. So even for the high school plays, competing for the roles was just terribly painful for me. I got the leads in the junior and senior high school plays, but mostly because I was glib, not because I was a deep actor. And we'll never know if I'm a deep actor because I acted very little once I got to Hollywood. Some, but very little.
What were the roles that you got as a junior and senior?
We did The Night of January 16th by Ayn Rand, a courtroom drama. I was the defense attorney, where the audience decides at the end of the play whether the accused is guilty or innocent. 2 out of the 3 nights I remember, the person I was defending was deemed not guilty by the audience. The 3rd night, they convicted her. Then the next year, the senior class play was Our Town. Oh, you can't do better. Helen Hunt's doing it on Broadway right now. I played Mrs. Gibbs. I was very much mother-like at the age of 17, and I have remained very much mother-like, even though I was never able to have children. I'm everybody's mother.
Where did you attend high school?
Kenyon, Minnesota, Kenyon High School. The building is now empty and crumbling. It's even tiny Kenyon, Minnesota, population 1,400 and dropping, is fraught with bureaucratic nonsense. So this great old high school, which I remember with such nostalgia, is sitting there crumbling in upon itself because they can't decide who owns it and what to do with it. Oh, isn't that a tragedy? If I lived there, I suppose I'd be actively pursuing something, but fortunately I don't live in Kenyon. I have great fond memories of it, but I have come to call California home. It is really home to me.
Did you attend college?
Yes. 1 year at St. Olaf College, where our family, if they could afford it, had all gone. It's a wonderful school in the middle of the Midwest. I was so miserable there that I was suicidal almost. So I was allowed to leave after a year, and wanting to go into the theater, which St. Olaf was not particularly noted for, I went to the University of Minnesota and started wearing black, with long leggings, and took the acting classes and was on the outskirts of the shop and the set building and all of those things. Dal DeLue, who did the sets for Cheers, Dal DeLue was one of the upperclassmen while I was in that marvelous theater department. And I did some of the best theater work of my life there. And didn't finish. Quit to get married impulsively. That lasted 7 years. And we were both rather flower children. My first husband, Ed, was drafted. No, in fact, he was told if he enlisted, he would not go to Vietnam. If he enlisted for 3 years, rather than waiting to be drafted for 2, no way would he go to Vietnam. And we were so gullible and so young that we believed this. So he enlisted and was immediately sent to Vietnam, of course. So I landed in Hollywood because his advanced infantry training was in Fort Ord. I never really had the courage to come to Hollywood, except that my marriage and my husband's Army service brought us here. And the marriage was already terribly troubled and very sad, and one of the saddest memories of my life. And he went to Vietnam. He was a flower child when he left. He was a flower child when he came back. He also aspired to being an actor, and he was a good one, but he couldn't earn a living, and we just didn't know each other. And so that was the second divorce in our family, which made kind of scandalous headlines back in the Kenyon Leader, the newspaper back in Minnesota at the time.
They actually published that you were getting a divorce?
Oh, yeah, yes. It was, it was kind of noted that Stephanie had a brief marriage that ended, and that someone remembered it had also happened to her mother. It was a sad little episode, sad chapter.
So when you came to Los Angeles, what kind of roles did you get, or what kind of jobs were you doing?
Well, I was fortunate to get any roles at all, because if somebody asked for a tall redhead to come in and audition along with 500 other tall redheads, I not because of any nobility on my part, but just my naive unwillingness to compete. I would help the other gals run their lines, waiting to go in and read, rather than taking care of myself. Never had I the thought, this role has my name on it, by God, I'm going to get it. Never had those thoughts. Somebody struggling with the lines, I'd say, would you like me to help you? Then she'd go in and bag the part. But in spite of that, I was a regular on a series called The Girl with Something Extra, starring Sally Field and John Davidson, where she could read his mind. I think it only lasted 1 year. I played John Davidson's secretary, and there was potential, they said, for more of a role by the time the second season rolled around, but the show didn't continue. I starred in one movie, because I was tall, called Big Mo, later re-released as Maury, I think. It was a true story about a basketball player named Maurice Stokes, whose best friend, a basketball player named Jack Twyman, helped him through a crippling paralysis. Jack Twyman, being a tall basketball player, was married to a tall wife, and that's how I got the role. So suddenly I had a co-starring role in a movie. I did a couple of other spots in little films, or little spots in important films. I played a reporter, and by then I kind of was one, so it was typecasting, in something called The Fortune that starred George C. Scott. And I remember walking up a sidewalk to the open door where George C. Scott opens it and says hello to the reporters. I'm one of the reporters. Well, at that time, I was working daily in Hollywood doing a morning news show. The door opened. I'm nervous as a cat, knowing I'm going to be meeting the great George C. Scott. And before the cameras rolled, George C. Scott looked at me and said, "Hello, Stephanie." He evidently watched the morning show that I was doing. Well, I was so flabbergasted that I wept. And so we had to let Stephanie get control of herself before we took the small scene. Basically, it was, "Hello, Mr. So-and-so, tell us about this." And then I was gone. I was done for the day. A couple of other little pieces in movies, but nothing really to remember.
So how tall are you?
I was 5'10" and a quarter at one time. I haven't dared check lately. You widen and you shrink, and it's not fun to chronicle that.
Was there ever a point in your coming up in Los Angeles and getting roles in film and small roles and things like that that you thought that you didn't want to be an actor?
No, I always knew I wanted to be an actor, but it was a completely unlived career. I recognized early on that whether I wanted it and whether or not I was good at it was beside the point. I could not compete. And fortunately, I guess, because it was the only career I've really ever had, I was mentored by one of the finest reporters in journalism, Ralph Story, for whom I went to work as a secretary. My first job in L.A. was as a secretary to 3 account executives at Foote Cone Belding Advertising. I was very fortunate to get that job. Downtown L.A., just like the Mad Men series of the current day, that was that time, late 60s, early 70s. And then eventually I couldn't handle that. Commuting downtown L.A. as a secretary to ad executives, I knew I'd never get anywhere in show business. So I happened to have seen Ralph Story do his Sunday night program called Ralph Story's Los Angeles. A unique gift he had. And I wrote him, in a kind of a rare burst of courage, I wrote him a letter and said, "Mr. Story, I plan to be a great actress, but in the meantime, I need work. Do you know of a place in show business where I might fit?" And Ralph, being the mentor he was, called me the day that he got the letter, brought me into the CBS station in the middle of Hollywood, sat me down in front of a stack of magazines about cars, and said, "Now, Stephanie, today you will go through these articles and you'll make notes from these automotive magazines, and from your notes, I will write the piece I'm going to do on tonight's big news. I said, Mr. Story, I don't do that. And he said, yes, you do. And that was the beginning of his mentoring me into a field I had no aspirations for, no training for. 3 years later, he was starting a new morning show at an ABC station here in LA, and told them at ABC that he was bringing a co-host along. Well, we all turned with interest. Who is this? And he said, my secretary, Stephanie. What? Everyone said. The executives were not happy. I said, I don't do that. And Ralph said, yes, you do. So after working for Ralph as a secretary for 3 years, I was given on a platter a work history that I would never have even thought of pursuing. And he had said to me, you know, Stephanie, you might be a great actress, but I doubt it. However, in the 3 years I've known you, I've learned that you can talk, and I suggest that you talk for a living. And I did.
So you didn't go for any other acting jobs in the course of those 3 years, or desire to?
I did. I desired it, and I did go to acting class at night and did some productions, and that's where I met Murray, my beloved husband, who was a pretty busy actor at that time, Murray McLeod. He was doing a lot of westerns on television, some films. He was breathtakingly beautiful, and he was good. And I remembered having seen him years before I met him in an episode of Run for Your Life with Ben Gazzara. I'd spotted this actor doing what I think was an Emmy-nominated role. I'd never forgotten that actor. I happened to run into him in this acting class. He was such a blowhard, I thought. I remember writing home to Mother, there's this actor, I remember his work, he was very good, but he is such a windbag. And he told me later he thought I was pretty stuck-up. And we were in the same acting class doing productions together for several years. And then my marriage ended. Ed came back from Vietnam. I introduced him to our acting class. They had all waited to see who Stephanie's husband was. He'd been in Vietnam for a year. Murray told me later that when Ed walked in for that first night, everybody looked at each other and said, no, 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 these two do not belong together. But we did some plays together after Ed got back home. And when Ed and I separated, and Murray and I were working on the music of one of our productions, he was almost engaged to another gal. I certainly wasn't interested in anyone else. I was coming off a very painful 7-year marriage and an impending divorce. But after Ed and I separated, Murray and I were working on music for one of our productions together, and suddenly the lights went on. And it's funny how you can look at somebody differently after having known them for several years and say, oh my gosh, be still my heart. And that's what happened to us. We were very fortunate. We are very blessed. 35 years later, we're planning on taking an anniversary trip to Great Britain. Murray has a Scots history, and we love that area of the world, so we hope to go soon.
How do you think you learned the technique for interviewing and hosting shows?
Whatever I learned was at the elbow of a master. Ralph Story, I believe, was one of the last of the trench coat reporters. Edward R. Murrow, to some extent Cleet Roberts, and a few others. Charles Collingwood, Walter Cronkite, where they could look at the same circumstance others looked at, but so succinctly paint the story and then get out of the way of the story. so I had seen Ralph work, and he had a wonderful vision of all of the interest that Los Angeles would show you if you paid attention. Then when he was doing a morning interview program, an hour or an hour and a half every morning where things go so quickly, he could have failed. He could have not been the best of who he was, but he didn't fail because his winsome attitude toward life and his fascination for the minutia of a story that others might miss was always there, no matter who we interviewed. So I was there, co-interviewing with him or learning from him about how to construct that hour of live television every day. And all I had to do was just soak it up. I was really, really fortunate, not only to work with a master, but to be mentored by the master. You know, sharing, paying attention to somebody else, watching her flower just for the sheer sake of watching a kid succeed is pretty rare in this business. People are too wrapped up in themselves to mentor, because mentoring takes time. Well, Ralph was a born mentor, and he just showed me how it was done.
How did you do in your first shows on the air with him?
I suppose I was sober. I remember being scared. It took me a while to loosen up. But it didn't take too long because Ralph and I, remember, had already known each other 3 years. I had been his secretary, of course, but we had a shared wit, and he was so free that he didn't put the clamps on. He didn't remind me that this is the Ralph Story program. He brought me in to share the turf. Most rare, still today. I've worked with many other men in a host or co-host position on the air, and I have never been treated as much an equal as I was by Ralph on the very first work I really ever did.
So you were fairly comfortable on camera because you were with him?
Yes, and I did find, he was right, I did find that while I was uncomfortable in an audition, I was not uncomfortable if I had to ad-lib on camera. It was a natural experience for me, as you might have noticed. I'm not proud of it, but I guess that's just where my niche was. Yeah.
You weren't proud of it?
Well, verbosity is a terrible thing, you know, because you can be so taken with your own awareness that you can carry a conversation that pretty soon you carry them on too long. You use too many words. My younger sister has always said, "You've always used too many words." and she's right. So, you know, you have to be careful with that ability. And I think that maybe those who are glib these days are not careful enough.
What was AM Los Angeles?
It was actually Ralph Story's AM. I think that's what you're referring to, that first thing. And then after Ralph went on the air with what was really a new, casual morning show kind of news entertainment venue with colorful sets and lots of feature pieces along with some pretty hard-hitting interviews. Then there were lots of LA in the morning, AM LA, Los Angeles mid-morning LA. I did them all. But it was kind of Ralph who began that, and then ABC Network used his local LA morning show as its role model for what eventually became Good Morning America. And in their infinite corporate wisdom, decided they could transfer that show that was the product of Ralph's inventive brain. They could transfer it to New York and make it a nationwide program to go up against the Today Show without hiring Ralph, thinking that Ralph, at the ripe old age of 56, was too old to put on a nationwide show that would compete against the Today Show. So they didn't hire the man from whose brain this idea sprung. They left him here in LA and hired me, the kid, to go to New York, presumably to write my own feature pieces, as I had been doing, and to have the same sort of experience in New York across the country that we'd had locally in LA. Well, it was an abysmal catastrophe. I was there for 5 months. I begged them to release me from my contract. I had wall-to-wall migraines. I said, if I never work again, please let me out. They wouldn't let me write my own feature pieces, as it turned out. When I got to New York, the clamps were put on us. The most important thing about Stephanie was the color she wore that morning. It was a calamity. And in my foolish youth, and because I was so sick with migraine headaches, I quit. Had I to do it over again, I would have planted my feet and let them take me out of there on a slab, because at least I'd have gotten severance pay. At this point, I quit and I disappeared. With the one proviso, they said, we will release you from your contract if you promise not to talk about the details or your feelings about the show. And like an idiot, I agreed. The morning it was announced that Stephanie was off the show, it was implied in the Hollywood Reporter and Variety that I'd been fired, that I was the problem that was causing the show to be a mess. Tom Snyder, who was on the air every night at that time, called me and said, come on my show and talk about what really happened. I said, I can't, Tom. I have agreed not to speak. By the time I flew back to L.A., my name was mud. And I really didn't get much work at all for at least 3 years.
What did you do in that time?
I got married to Murray, and we just hunkered down and crossed our fingers, and he did some acting, and I did a little bit of stuff for the local PBS station. And then somewhere along the line, a morning concept showed up again in LA, and I was hired to do it. Oh, and I began being the spokesperson for Lucky Supermarkets, which lasted 18 years.
Wow.
Saved my life.
So when you were with Ralph in Los Angeles, what was the viewer response then to your relationship?
It was warm, loving, friendly. We had a marvelous audience. You know, daytime local television was not an ordinary thing then. Yes, the Today Show existed out of New York and so on, but local morning shows that were ambitious and had a lot of color and variety to them were still rather unknown. And so we found an audience immediately, and we had a wonderful, wonderful rapport with our audience. It was commonly assumed that I had been hired because I was in some sort of a romantic relationship with this older gentleman, Ralph Story. In those days, it was still very, very commonly assumed that if a young kid out of nowhere was suddenly prominent, she was sleeping her way into the job. But it was not at all true. Ralph was just a gentleman and a mentor. And so we just weathered it. And eventually I think people understood that that was not our relationship at all.
What kind of interviews did you do on the air with him?
I remember them as having tremendous variety. We had political candidates, I remember, and those were the days when we were wearing hot pants. And I would sit on the air in short shorts interviewing Ed Muskie, who was running for president. I mean, it was just grotesque, but wonderful, and everybody kind of went along with it. One day we would be interviewing the head of the American Nazi Party. The next day, a great author. The following day, John Wayne, who came in, I remember, with a terrible bandage wrapped around his hand. It was 7 a.m. And we asked, what happened to you? He had ordered a box of knives that had been packed blade up. And he'd opened that box that morning, stuck his hand into the box, and sliced the palm of his hand on this blade. But John Wayne, being John Wayne, showed up and he was just fine. We had a great variety, and in those days, lots of touchy-feely stuff. Eric Siegel, love story. Lots of people writing books about, how to be your own best friend. Many of those interviews I remember. And then we went out and did some stuff on location, too, and just had what I now look back on as rather hard work, but a good time. I would review plays and films at night, and, come bleary-eyed in the next morning with my review. But you see how Ralph allowed this, and the management at the local ABC station, Channel 7 in LA, allowed me to cut my teeth on all this stuff, experimenting with what tanning lotions worked on strips on my arm, and then being allowed at the same time to sit in on an interview with Hubert Humphrey. That was a rare opportunity.
So what do you think were your strengths as a host?
I was told that people appreciated that I read their book, and I took the Evelyn Wood reading dynamics course, where you basically you turn the page and you make a question mark down the page, and then the next round, and then you turn the page and you make a question mark down these pages, and you think, I'm not going to retain any of this. I cannot do this. Well, you do. It's not fun to read that way, although they touted it as being something you'd really enjoy. Like you read Jaws in 10 minutes and you get the full impact of the Peter Benchley book. No, I would much rather have read it at my own pace. But if you have to get into 3 books a night and have some sort of working knowledge of it, you can do it. And so I did do that. So I was told that authors appreciated that I was very familiar with their book and that I listened to what they had to say rather than planning my next question. That seemed to be very appreciated. And there were lessons I learned when that did not follow true to form. I remember Maria von Trapp coming on early in my career. She was already elderly and ornery. You don't expect Maria von Trapp to be ornery. But she was in a heck of a bad mood that morning. And I asked her, this is very early in my work, I asked, and what happened to your father? I asked her. And she said, if you had read my book, you would know that he died in chapter 7. And that was the last time I was not familiar with at least the beginning, the middle, and the end of a book. You learn your lessons by failing,
Had you said anything else before or after that you regretted in an interview?
Oh, yes. And Ralph would usually laugh at my stupidity, which kind of, embarrassed me at the moment, but softened the blow. I can remember not knowing something about an alcoholic beverage, and I asked, won't it spoil? And Ralph howled about that because, of course, the alcohol was the perfect preservative and it wasn't going to spoil at all. Silly little mistakes that come from youth. But, again, he and our producers, kids themselves, he mentored a lot of people, prepared us so well that our mistakes were not major, they were minor. And that was because no matter how open and free a show is, it better be well produced, or you're going to look like an idiot more often than you should. In later shows, where the talent was not as rich and not as much care was taken, and we were thrown on the air to kind of just, twist in the wind, I know that I looked stupid. Later on, morning shows where I was interviewing sports figures, I was way out of my depth. But if you can keep talking and keep asking the next question and let the expert talk, then you save yourself. Usually you remember, of course, the moments that were just great. Tennessee Williams, for instance, who admitted during an interview on a show called Every Day, one of my favorite shows. It lasted only a year. We were a cast of 7. Every Day it was called. Interviews, music, sketches, the works. Fabulous year. Tennessee Williams was on the show with us and admitted to his being quite a drinker during his entire career of writing. And I asked, do you think you might have done even more brilliant work had you been sober? And Tennessee Williams said to me, inebriated even at that moment, he said, "What? Improve on Blanche Dubois?" Isn't that wonderful? It's those little rich moments that you savor and recall, in the midst of all the dross of the stupid interviews that come and go and you can't remember a darn thing about them.
When you were in New York, you had moved from Minnesota to Los Angeles and then to New York, three really distinct areas of the country. Did you think that being in New York contributed to some of the problems that you felt were going on in the show?
Yes, I was so not a New Yorker, and I was working with people who were. Speaking of being out of my depth, I was way out. New York was just a horrifying place to me. I'd stay in my apartment. People in the staff would say, "We go out here. We go out at night. We eat at 8 or 9 or 10 p.m. You gotta go. You gotta get out." I was in bed with a migraine. I did not cotton to the whole New York lifestyle, and I have a terrible memory for numbers. So I didn't know Fifth Avenue from 64th Street. I didn't know where I was. My only landmark was that I was living in a tall high-rise directly across the street from Lincoln Center. Lincoln Center. That's all I knew. I remember Murray, who was my beau at that point, we were not yet married, drew me a little map with Central Park in the middle. He didn't know New York much better than I did, but he knew enough. And I followed that map when I had to go out grocery shopping and stuff. And if I turned east or west, I had to turn the map. I was hopeless in New York, hopeless. And kept to myself. Well, you don't keep to yourself in New York. Certainly not if you're on the cover of magazines, and I was. I was supposed to be the girl who would knock Barbara Walters off the air. That was one of the headlines in the magazine. Well, you see how that went. So I was supposed to be out there grabbing the brass ring, and I was cowering in this apartment that I had rented and hurting. My head was hurting. I would lean over, throw up in a bucket during the commercial, and get back up and continue the show. I couldn't think. I could not think. And having been hired to write my own material, when I got to New York, I found they were not letting me write my own material. In fact, one of the writers hired for AM America was Tom Meehan, the fellow who happened in the office right next door to mine with cigarette smoke curling from underneath his closed door. Tom Meehan was writing Annie while he was supposed to be writing for AM America. I doubt he would have minded my telling that story. It turned out wonderfully for him. You see, that's the thing. He knew how to use that time. He knew how to fight the fight. He got the job. He'd turn in something for the next day's AM America, which it was called at that point. But what he was really doing in his office, right next to mine, was writing Annie. I just sat in my office in a daze and would find little memos in the file folder saying, "No need to tell Stephanie about this decision, wouldn't want to alarm her." I had become kind of the person to avoid. Stephanie's too serious. She's too worried about the content of the pieces. She's not having any fun. Well, there was nothing to have fun with, really, you see. So I didn't fight. At least I didn't fight in a way that developed a power base. Peter Jennings, who was our newsman out of Washington, took the train up one day from Washington and said, "I need to see you for dinner tonight. Meet me so-and-so and such and such." I, bleary-eyed from migraine, meet Peter Jennings. Peter said, "Stephanie, you've got to save the show." "I've got to stay? What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, you're the woman." And over the years, I've thought about exactly what it was he was saying to me then. In a way, what he was saying, beyond the obvious, use your sexual wiles, whatever they might have been, and they were minimal. Beyond that, he was saying, because you are a woman, you have some power by being unpredictable, eccentric, grabbing some headlines. Everybody's looking at you. They're wondering if you can compete with Barbara Walters. Use it. They need to keep you here. I could not grasp that. And I basically said, Peter, I'm doing the best I can, and nobody's listening to me. Oh, he was impatient. He said, you don't know how to use your power. And I didn't. And I have never really known how to use it when I guess I had it on various shows that came and went. I've never been very good at using power. So, having worked as many years as I have to say I've been blessed. I've been very lucky to work all these years without having the aggressive crust that you usually need to have as the bottom line of however you're going to make a career work.
Do you think that Peter Jennings came and spoke to you about it on his own, or do you think it was because ABC asked him to intercede?
No. By then, I think ABC would have been happy to see me go. They just had to figure out a way to get rid of me. It was Peter who, on his own, saw the catastrophe that the show was. And Peter had a very strong ego. He didn't want to be involved with a joke. And AM America, as it started out, was a joke. It was a joke. I left in May, but the entire group was gone by October. And they redesigned it. And it was at that point that it became Good Morning America. They finally figured it out.
They didn't. Did they ask Ralph to go to New York and do the show?
No. They asked him occasionally to bring a feature in from L.A. They decided Ralph was too old to be a major part of the show out of whose brain they tried to make a duplicate. And he was only, like I say, 56 or younger. It was one of those confounded, foolish executive decisions that can ruin careers. And I met, really for the first time there, the kind of personality in television that I have met many of since. People who are not very good at anything except keeping the job they've got. I don't know how they do it, but they slide from being inefficient in one job into being inefficient on another job. The show may die, careers may end, but those people who aren't very gifted continue to work. I didn't understand it then, and I don't understand it now.
How did Ralph feel about not being asked to go to New York?
I suppose it hurt him very much. It must have. But he didn't let me know it. He was completely supportive, as usual.
Do you think that he probably didn't want you to go, though? I mean, in his heart of hearts, he probably wanted to keep you
Possibly.
with him.
You know, a very little-known fact, and why should anybody care? A little-known fact is this. I loved Ralph as much as a father. I loved him, and I love him to this hour. But Ralph was not easy to work with. And finally, after coming home to my little apartment 3 years into the morning show that he and I did every day, and throwing plates against the wall and crying myself to sleep because Ralph was tough, I went in and quit. I quit Ralph Stories AM before I was hired on the network. There was a 6-week gap between the time I quit Ralph Story and had no clue about what I was going to do with the rest of my life and the time that AM America was offered to me. People never really recognized that, and I don't even know that Ralph remembered it, but that was the truth. I've quit too many good jobs. As Ralph said to me, neither you, Stephanie, nor I have ever been particularly good for our careers because we walk when a project is hopeless. We walk, and we shouldn't walk. We should plant our feet. Look at Joan London. I believe Joan London did Good Morning America for 14 years. I think part of the reason she did it was that she didn't let things bother her very much. She had 3 daughters. They fixed up a nursery in her office. I didn't even have a typewriter for the first 2 months I was there. Couldn't get one. They said, "Why do you need a typewriter?" Well, I said, I was hired to write my own copy. Well, that's not the way it's going to be. Joan London seemed to have that kind of ability, that Teflon ability, where the bad stuff just rolled off her head and she just planted her feet and she stayed there for 14 years.
Who was your co-host on AM America?
Bill Butel. He was a New York local nighttime newsman. Now deceased. Bill is gone. Peter Jennings is gone. Mayor John Lindsay was one of our contributors. Jesse Jackson would fly in from Chicago to be one of our contributors every once in a while. But Bill and I were presumably the anchors, although it was Bill and the girl. That's kind of the way it actually worked out.
What kind of contract did they give you?
They had given me an 18-month contract. They had asked for 2 years, and when I went to New York, dreading this great opportunity, I said, please, let's make it a year. Could we please make it a year? And they said, we'll settle. Let's make it 18 months. So I begged out of that 7 months after I got there.
Did you have any kind of relationship with Peter Jennings after the initial contact?
No. He knew I was planning to get married. He knew we were going to go to Scotland. I was leaving the show in the middle of May, and we were going to be married in L.A. in June and go to Scotland. Peter called and left a message with our secretary, I have some advice for Stephanie about where to go in Scotland and what to do and so on. And I left the message back with his secretary, thanks, please thank Peter for me, but we've already got our itinerary planned. At which he responded through the secretary, tell her to go to hell, which is the last word I ever heard from Peter Jennings.
Wow.
Yeah. He had, if I had had an iota of the ego that Peter Jennings had, I would have had a different career. And I look back on Peter and the good work that he did, and how he headed network news operations in various places all over the world, Beirut among them, London among them. He was Canadian, Peter was. And I realized you've got to have a certain amount of ego to gain the power and the respect you need in order to carry your work forward. He was good at that. I was not.
With AM America, what do you think ABC's expectations were for this show?
You know, that was one of the great mysteries. I don't think they knew. The executive producer kept saying, this is a back-of-the-book show, and I didn't know what back-of-the-book meant, and he could never explain it to me. And on the day we went into a press conference with all of the country's press assembled, Sally Quinn was one of them, sitting in the front row, I turned to the executive producer, who was bathed in sweat, flop sweat, and having not been prepared at all for what we were supposed to say to the world's assembled press about this new show to be born the following morning, I turned to the executive producer and asked, what do we do now? And he said, punt. And that's what we did. We went on the air every morning not knowing really what we were supposed to be doing. I think they decided that if they plucked a certain coterie of people from Ralph Story's show, and they took some of our producers along to New York with me, we were all kids, that it would magically transfer. But it didn't. You know, you need one mind that begins to guide a new, unfamiliar concept. We didn't have one mind in New York. We had 30 or 40 on that staff. That floor of the big ABC complex where we were working was full of bodies. And I don't know what they did.
Do you think that they thought that they would ever be in competition with NBC's Today Show?
That's what they were going to do. That was what their plan was. And can you imagine not really having a true, strong concept when you've got the world's press attending to what you're doing? The staff meetings were ridiculous. I don't know what they thought. I know we had very late night dinners with a lot of wine drunk in those days. The expense accounts were enormous. But, you know, I went home reeling from those dinners with a migraine. I don't remember what was accomplished.
What kind of stories did you enjoy covering in this very difficult period in your career?
I didn't enjoy anything because I wasn't allowed to cover or prepare. I was given notes in the morning. Occasionally something wonderful would happen, like Martin Luther King's father would come on the air and I would interview him. I'd been given a few crib notes and knew I was in the presence of a wonderful, eloquent man. Dustin Hoffman would come on the air, and even though he was rather ornery that morning too, it was Dustin Hoffman. But it was all serendipity. It wasn't planned. For instance, I was told one day that we were going to go down to the Fulton Fish Market, which every New Yorker knows about. It was Greek to me. So we get in cabs or cars, whatever it was, go down to the Fulton Fish Market. I'm dressed in a yellow slicker and somehow end up on the back of an elephant. I don't remember why. But I was supposed to be reading off of cue cards, having not been prepared for the interview on the back of an elephant in the Fulton Fish Market. But the girl holding the cue cards, which I've never rehearsed, is a block and a half away. And I'm saying, I can't see the cue cards. Well, the stage manager says, I know, she's afraid of elephants. That was what we went through every day. Go figure.
Did you have contact with your contributors like Reverend Jesse Jackson?
Yes, to some extent. You know, intermittent. He would fly in from Chicago, be there overnight. In the early days, all of us who were imported from someplace out of town stayed at the Essex House. And I remembered that fondly and nostalgically. So when we were in New York last summer, Murray and I stopped by the Essex House. It's completely different now, of course. So yes, we had a kind of a superficial relationship, but didn't really get to know each other very well. John Lindsay, you know, would come in and out in the office of a morning, and I remember being invited by him and his wife Mary to their marvelous apartment at the Hotel des Artistes, I think, this wonderful building. And they had a loft, you know, that was a couple of stories high with books around a balcony. Fabulous. But they were little events. We didn't really get to know each other, and I was only there 7 months. I did make one of the best friends of my life, though. A gal from New York who then later worked out here and still lives here now in Los Angeles. Her name was Linda Birkin. She was a wonderful coordinator of gifts, parties, getting people together, and she worked for a lot of high-up executives in the movie industry after she moved to L.A. Linda became a fast friend and is to this hour. But she's a typical New Yorker in that I got off the plane for the first time in New York. The plane has been delayed, flying over around and around Kennedy Airport. I'm sick with a migraine already, just as I enter New York for the first time. And I see this woman whom I'm guessing is Linda Birkin, standing there, because in those days they could meet the plane. And she has her hands on her hips and she's saying, "Where were you?" Well, I was circling Manhattan in a plane. I could do nothing else. And we have joked about that over the years because Linda had that aggressive New York, we got to get it done, here's how we're going to get it done. You cross Fifth Avenue and then you go down to the Bowery and then you're over at the Fulton Fish Market. She knew the ropes. And she really, for what steering I got, she gave that steering to me. And friendship. Why, I don't know, because I was a pill. I don't think I smiled for 7 months.